this brings me to the contemporary day of, I think it's March 24th, and it's 2017. So now I'm sitting on 6 years here at the University of Minnesota, and before that, 10 years at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where I lived on the reservation in Hayward and commuted for many years to teach tribal cohorts at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Coming here has meant I've been able to specialize much more on language and culture, which has been great. And so that my research is in Ojibwe language revitalization. And I told you when I started this little talk that that doesn't sound like post-feminist, postmodern feminist research and education, but I think it very much is informed and shaped by some of the central notions that were in your readings this week and continues to be. Okay, so that was my long introduction. I'm supposed to make this video interactive, so I think you should all respond now back to the video and tell me who you are. I'm sorry, I don't even have your class list. I do hope I get to meet you. Okay, the second thing I wanted to do was to, I'm not sure if this is going to work. I think it'll work. Take a research question. So I assume that you've probably talked quite a bit, as this is a methods course, about how this is not the little m methods. These are not techniques. Rather, this is the big M methods, which gets pretty messy as soon as you start to think about a little deeper than how are you going to collect data. You know, the particular, am I going to do interviews? Am I going to do survey? Am I going to do those things? This really gets into the ideological positioning and theoretical positioning of your research that then, of course, dictates the questions you're going to ask and how you're going to ask them and how you're going to shape the entire project. So this is the big M methods, as you can clearly see, and some of the guiding concepts, I'm going to try to just weave them in. I think that would be more interesting than going through one by one and saying, this is what I think is discourse, and this is bricolage, and this is identity, and this is deconstruction. So in thinking about this, I'm thinking about a research project that I have on the horizon right now, working with a learning scientist who does science education. And we were just funded by the National Science Foundation to replicate her research, which has been in English, in Ojibwe. And the idea behind her research was that for many years, she did something called forest walks, which are akin to the water walks, if you've heard of those. But forest walks mean there's a dyad, an adult and a child, who wear a point of view camera and go on a walk of about 20 minutes in an area that maybe they're familiar with, a wooded area. And this is a thing Native people do, walk, talk. And we're not looking at the discourse that they generate just in terms of content. We're actually looking at it in terms of how they construct knowledge together. So Megan did this over 10 years with a guy named Doug Medine, who's a cognitive psychologist at Northwestern. And what they did was they compared these dyads. They did tons of analysis on language, which encompasses not just what people say, but how they say it, their gaze, their gestures, their pauses, their perspective, what they're looking at, how they call attention to something. All of those things that really deeply conjure notions of pedagogy and construction of knowledge. So my project now is to replicate that in Ojibwe with dyads of Ojibwe speakers, which it's a very rare moment because we have elders only above 70, a few scattered here and there in each community, and we have children who have learned by coming through the immersion schools for 6-7 years, who are pretty fluent by the time they hit 4th grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, in there somewhere. And so I've done a pilot, and the analysis is very much informed by querying some of the common sense notions of what is the natural world and how do we construct the natural world. And furthermore, more deeply probably in the bigger project, is to queer science about this. Whose science? Is science neutral? Is the science that we're studying, the methods we're studying, actually have a cultural perspective? That's the question. That's the querying. So, for example, if I was a graduate student and I had a question, something like, and I invite you to submit your own for the discussion, just make up one. I know it's a big thing to make up a research question, but for now, a placeholder generalized question such as, how do elementary teachers construct their relationship to the natural world? How do they think of themselves, and how do they understand the natural world, for example? So elementary science teachers teaching all kinds of science, earth science, physical science, and maybe I'm going to interview them, and do 20 case studies. I'm going to interview them. I'm going to see how they pick their curriculum. I'm going to see what they choose, why they choose it, and then I'm going to watch them teach. So in all these modes, I'm going to look for what is their own personal ideology, their guiding light of what is the natural world. Okay, so the question as an example is, how would we queer, or how would feminist methods inform this question? So some of the things we could do, like the King and Cronin study, we could look at the categories. We could look at the categories that they construct when they're talking about the natural world. For example, and we would deconstruct those categories. For example, do they see themselves as part of the natural world or not? Are humans, in their way of thinking, expressed as animals or not? And this is turns out to be a very significant difference that is easily viewed in, for example, in the Ojibwe language. The construction is about two-leggeds and winged ones and those that swim. It's not around mammals. It's not around humans, animals as distinct categories. It's not around plants versus animals, particularly. Those are categories of a particular cultural viewpoint. Okay, so where does gender come in? You may be wondering at this point. So we did one thing. We looked at categories. We could look at language. We could apply anything that is suspect or seems common sense, especially. We could apply deconstruction to, right? I think one of the quotes I wrote down, oh no, I'm not going to find it, was from Spivak. And she said, persistently to critique a structure that one cannot, parentheses, wish to inhabit. So really trying to get out of your own common sense notions that would be there in the question, and to go one level beyond and to question that, and to then deconstruct that and say, where is this situated? Where are the categories? Where are the binaries? Or especially suspect in humanism, we see binaries of man and women, for example. So that would be something I'd look for in this construction of the natural world. Is there a construction of gender that mimics that as a binary of man and woman? And what else is there? And what other ways could it be constructed that are on the edges of your imagination? I love how St. Pierre urges us to think differently. If it seems very common sense, very natural, ask, where is it constructed? Where can you deconstruct the normal, the natural? How is a discourse functioning? So in this question, for example, the discourse of science, and I'm picking on science because it's one of the most powerful currently, one of the most well-funded, one of the most respected in terms of this is where we're going to find our knowledge, our answers. This is the rational, objective way to find things out. And I think a little bit of deconstruction of that discourse goes a long way. So in a little discourse way, for example, what counts as knowledge for your dissertation, even for your prelims, before your dissertation, is what your committee says. So we can very much see it's constructed at that point. Your committee are peers that are part of larger organizations, affiliations, meetings, institutional structures who also meet and discuss and agree on the legitimacy of that discourse. And that's what counts as science education. It's not an objective, neutral value that is the best of rationality somehow. It's very much subjectively constructed. Certain people, certain objects are produced and regulated through that discourse, which is what it means to get a PhD in that discourse of science education, for example. Okay, so we got quite a long way with that that example, I think, and I would just ask you to stop and think about in your own discipline what are some of the main common sense notions. Maybe they're currently being deconstructed by feminists, by queers, by people of color who have a certain epistemological stance. Maybe they're being darkened, right? And the other thing that's happening at the same time is that we're getting better at identifying what is whiteness and where is it. Because I would argue many of the ideas in the example we were just talking about particular taxonomies of the natural world, come from a very particular construction of science that is Eurocentric. And Eurocentric is even in itself very problematic, borrowing from great empires in Africa, the idea of zero, borrowing from Timbuktu in Greece. Is that all part of the Western world? We're sort of glossing it, or I am at this moment. And that's another idea that we have to use when we're writing and describing ideas, to get them to stand still for a moment. So identity is always fluid is another very important idea, again pushing against a unitary subject. But if identity is always fluid, how can I even use a category that says, well, this is white European? And we'll call that for now strategic essentialism, another idea from Spivak, that just for a moment we're going to hold it in place as a category, knowing that category is comprised of discursive practices, individuals, complex ideologies that are moving and have movement, and that tend to get reified or unified for political purposes in institutions, for legitimacy, for power. And for our case as writers, as thinkers, we want to sometimes use those categories, full knowing all of those things I just said about temporariness. Okay. That's 13 minutes. I did an introduction. I did an example of an elementary science teacher. I think I want to go back there for just a minute. So if you were going to do that research of an elementary science teacher, a bunch of them, say 20, we said case studies, how then might you reshape your questions or even reshape your inquiry, knowing that their position as a science teacher is also a fluid identity, and they have other parts of their identity. So maybe at that point, it becomes to think about, oh, what are the other pieces holistically of their identity? Maybe this particular 25-year-old science teacher is a lesbian. Maybe she's a feminist. Maybe she's from Indonesia. Maybe these things influence her constructions of the natural world.